I was bored out of my mind during the lecture, so I decided to send a message to my online boyfriend. Chris, transfer $5 for strawberries, I'll make it up to you next time and give you 10 kisses. You're the best. The next second, the exact same message appeared on the big screen. And the professor, known for his cold and aloof image, didn't even flinch. He calmly replied, "I'm working, we'll talk tonight." I froze. My roommate dragged me around to attend lectures in order to earn some extra credits. Within 3 hours, 5 professors took turns on stage. I sat there, feeling like my butt was going numb. When the 6th professor came on, the crowd erupted into cheers. My roommate was excited, elbowing me. "Anna, look. Professor Miller. Professor Miller is here." I looked up. It was him, the youngest legend in our department, Chris Miller. He'd only been on campus for a short time, but with his godlike face and cool, reserved demeanor, he had quickly become the ultimate heartthrob, adored by many female students. At that moment, he was adjusting his PowerPoint slides, but even then, he exuded an aura of unapproachable perfection. As I was staring at his long, clean hands, I suddenly noticed a red and green bracelet on his wrist. It looked exactly like the good luck string I had recommended to my online boyfriend a while ago. Thinking of him, I couldn't help but remember the photo he had sent me last night. The defined muscles and the sensual vibe. It was the kind of thing that made your mind wander. I couldn't resist opening the chat. His last message had been about how he was off to work. That meant he was probably at work right now. Suddenly, I had an idea, time to prank him. I quickly typed a message. "Chris, transfer 5 for strawberries, I'll make it up to you next time and give you 10 kisses. You're the best." I hit send, and the next second, the entire lecture hall erupted into a roar. The noise was even louder than when Professor Miller first took the stage. My roommate was desperately pinching me. "Oh my God, Anna, look. Is that Professor Miller's girlfriend?" I stared up, confused. Then I saw it. The exact message I had just sent appeared on the big screen. There, standing at the front, Chris Miller was browsing through his slides, nonchalantly closing the chat box and pulling out his phone to type a few words. And then I got a reply from my online boyfriend. "I'm working, we'll talk tonight." I'm stunned. The noise in the auditorium continued to grow louder. "Did you see that? Professor Miller calls his girlfriend baby, he's so doting. Not just that, his girlfriend is the only one pinned at the top of his chats. Don't say that, please, nothing breaks my heart more than hearing that Miller has a girlfriend. Ugh, can you imagine? Every day, looking at that face, what kind of amazing life must his girlfriend have?" My roommate, who was a bit slow on the uptake, suddenly turned around. "Wait, Anna, I just noticed, Professor Miller's girlfriend's profile picture is the same as yours. What a coincidence." I forced out a couple of awkward laughs. "Really? Haha, I didn't notice." My roommate, disappointed by my lack of reaction, turned back around and resumed her conversation. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from Chris up at the podium. My heart was starting to race a little faster. The same Lucky Charm bracelet, the same profile picture, the same message. Everything was so clear. Chris was my online boyfriend. But, the contrast was too much. I couldn't stop replaying those bold abs pictures in my head. And now, seeing him here in front of me, dressed so neatly, speaking so gracefully, it made my face flush. Chris, so he was like that behind the scenes? For the rest of the lecture, I was completely distracted. All I could do was watch Chris's lips move while my mind replayed those images over and over again. When the lecture ended, Chris rushed off quickly. As he left, I overheard some girls from the row in front of me. "Did you hear that? It sounds like Professor Miller's in a hurry to go see his girlfriend." My heart skipped a beat. On my way back to the dorm, I was bombarded with messages from Chris. "What's wrong, babe? Why aren't you replying? I'm done with work, should we continue where we left off? What are you doing? You just disappear every time I try to reach out. I was in such a rush earlier, I forgot to transfer you the $5 for strawberries. Transfer, $50,000. Why aren't you replying? I stared at the flood of messages, feeling a little lost. It was hard to picture his face saying these things. And at the same time, I felt a bit embarrassed. How was I supposed to respond? Just as I was hesitating, I got a message from a senior in the next dorm. Anna, Professor Smith says his computer's acting up again. He wants you to take a look. Professor Smith was my advisor. Ever since I helped him fix a minor glitch on his computer last time, he'd kept asking me to help him with tech issues. I couldn't slack off, so I rushed over to his office. When I arrived, I was surprised to find that Chris was already there. He was sitting at a desk across from me, quietly looking down at his phone. He seemed a little upset. I didn't dare to look at him too much. I kept my gaze fixed on the computer, trying to stay focused while I worked. After I finished fixing Smith's computer, he smiled with his eyes half closed, clearly pleased. I knew Anna would be the one to figure it out. He paused and then added, by the way, Miller mentioned his social media isn't receiving messages. Can you help him check it out too? He pointed to Chris. I froze for a moment. I almost instantly realized why Chris's social media wasn't receiving messages. Could I even fix that? But with Smith's expectant smile, I had no choice but to walk over, forcing my voice to sound rougher than usual. Professor Miller, Smith said your social media might be broken. Chris was clearly lost in thought. I startled him when I spoke, and he instinctively shifted his body to create some distance between us. No, it's fine. He usually kept a polite distance from me, which worked out perfectly. Just as I was about to turn and leave, Chris's gaze suddenly fixed on my hand. I was holding my phone, and the screen was on, showing a picture of a little puppy. I immediately remembered. I'd sent my online boyfriend plenty of pictures of my dog. And I had picked my favorite one to make it my wallpaper. Realizing Chris was staring intently at my phone, I quickly shoved it into my pocket. Professor Miller, if there's nothing else, I'll be going now. But then Chris suddenly spoke. Wait. He reached out and stopped me in my tracks. Can I see your phone wallpaper? My heart jumped into my throat. Did he recognize me? Without thinking, I instinctively blocked the pocket where my phone was, stammering. Maybe it's not really convenient. Chris raised an eyebrow slightly, puzzled. What's wrong? I blurted the first thing that came to my mind. Because my phone wallpaper is kind of private. Chris paused for a second, then his expression softened into an apologetic one. Sorry, I didn't mean to offend. It's just, when I saw the little dog on your wallpaper, it reminded me of one that saved me a while back. I just wanted to confirm. If it's too private, you can cover the sensitive part. I was completely thrown off. When did my dog save him? But seeing the earnest look in Chris's eyes, I hesitantly pulled out my phone and showed him. He barely glanced at the photo, but when he looked back at me, his expression had shifted, becoming more curious and expectant. He asked gently. Is this your dog? I instantly snatched my phone back. What the hell was I doing? Rescue dog? He was clearly testing me. No. Of course not. I shook my head frantically, my brain working overtime. This is my sister's dog. Chris tilted his head, looking confused. Your sister? I nodded so vigorously I almost gave myself whiplash. Without missing a beat, I pulled out my phone again, scrolling to the chat history where I'd been sending all sorts of random messages to my anonymous account. Yeah, look, this is the picture my sister sent me back then. I pointed to the picture of the puppy I sent to my anonymous trumpet at the time. Thank God I had the habit of using my anonymous account as a garbage bin. Chris leaned in closer to look, his eyes instantly lighting up. He pointed to my social media profile picture. This is your sister? I suddenly felt a deep sense of dread. Quickly, I tried to distance myself from the situation. But we're not really that close. But Chris seemed even more excited now. He reached out to shake my hand. Hey, can you leave me your contact info? I might need your help with something later. I really didn't want to give Chris my contact information. But when Chris said that, I noticed him glancing at Professor Smith, who was standing not far off. Professor Smith had my real social media account. If Chris went around asking someone else for my contact info, I'd be exposed immediately. So I quickly added him on my anonymous account. And I smiled brightly at him, saying, "Of course. No problem, Professor Miller." But as soon as I turned away, my face dropped. What on earth was I doing, new? Although Chris was my online boyfriend and almost always obeyed me. That was because he liked the version of me online. If he found out I was his student in real life. If he found out about those risque photos he'd sent me, or all those cheesy, over-the-top love confessions. With his personality, he'd definitely be mortified. And I could already imagine it, I'd get dumped, and maybe even harassed by him at school. The best thing to do would be to break up with him first, quietly, without him noticing. Though I honestly kind of didn't want to. As I walked down the hallway, I received another message from Chris. "Baby, I just found out one of my students is your sister. Isn't that a coincidence? She even has your dog's photo as her wallpaper. You must be really close, right? Don't misunderstand, baby, I just happened to see it. I wasn't investigating you. Why aren't you replying to me? Transfer, $20,000. Reading his messages one after another, my emotions were all over the place. I made a snap decision and just turned on the Do Not Disturb mode. When I got back to the dorm, I packed my things quickly. I logged into my anonymous account, only to find that Chris had sent me a message there too. "Anna, can you get in touch with your sister right now?" I waited for a bit before replying. "Nope, can't get in touch, Professor Miller." I thought that would calm him down. But the very next second, my eyes went wide in shock. Chris had sent 2 messages to my real account. "Baby, did something happen to you? Hold on, I'm going to call the police right now." I flinched. What the hell? Call the cops? That would be the end of me. What on earth is going on in Chris's mind? I quickly typed out a reply. "I'm here, I accidentally fell asleep this afternoon." Chris immediately breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank God, you scared the hell out of me. When you didn't reply all day, I was freaking out." "Baby, you're not going to leave me, are you?" The moment I read those words, a rush of indescribable emotion washed over me. It was like being suddenly stabbed by something sharp. Chris had always been so considerate, always spending money on me, showing off his abs. I'd been thinking about breaking up with him. Wasn't that a little too cruel? But if this dragged on, how long could I keep pretending? The more I thought about it, the more miserable I felt. My nose tingled, and before I knew it, 2 hot tears fell down my cheeks. Just then, my roommate happened to pass by, and she stopped in her tracks, startled. "Anna, what's wrong?" When I turned to look at her, everything in front of me was blurry. Without missing a beat, she pulled me into a tight hug. "Who's been messing with you?" She looked ready to fight with someone. I couldn't help but sob as I spoke. "Susie, what would you do if you found out your online boyfriend is actually someone completely man who doesn't exist in real life?" She let out a breath of relief. "That's it? That's your problem? At worst, just break up with him. He's just a guy. With your looks, are you worried about not finding someone else?" Then she seemed to think of something and quickly changed the subject. "By the way, has he spent money on you? I've heard some guys, after a breakup, actually ask for the money they spent back from the girl. Gross, right?" I froze. Chris had spent quite a bit on me. Although there were some things I hadn't accepted. But, he couldn't be that kind of person, right? Noticing my hesitation, Susie quickly patted my shoulder. "Hey, it's fine if he spent money. Just, don't make the breakup too ugly, okay?" I was afraid to disconnect from Chris directly for fear he would call the police. Thinking about what my roommate had said, I also didn't want things to get too awkward between us. Tossing and turning, I reluctantly sent him a message. "What are you thinking?" He replied instantly. "I knew you'd be the best. Want to see some pics today? You seem to really like the ones I sent last night." My face immediately heated up. Huh? Was I that obvious? But, now that I knew what I'd seen last night was Chris's body, it felt even more thrilling. Yet, I hesitated for a moment. "Isn't this a bit much?" He replied as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "What's wrong with that? I like showing you." I was still uncertain, not sure if I should go along with it. Then, 10 minutes later, Chris sent me a lots of abs pic, each with a different angle. One of them stood out. His gray sweatpants were pulled down low, revealing a toned set of abs, and the outline of his V-line extended down, leading to a tantalizingly low waistband. I couldn't help but stare. He quickly followed up with, "Is this good?" It was absolutely perfect. But then, I thought of Chris in his buttoned-up shirt during his lectures, always so formal, so pristine, and I suddenly felt like I was committing a crime. This was Chris we were talking about. With great effort, I replied. "Please stop. I don't like these." He sent a confused emoji. "But you were so happy last night." Then he screenshot the stream of blood-splattered emojis I had sent him last night. And then, he kept teasing me, "Pull the pants down a bit more." I could only think, this is so wrong. It was scandalous. I squeezed my eyes shut and typed back. "That was all in the past. I've changed." After Chris sent a crying emoji, he didn't message me again for a long time. I logged into my alternate account to check. Sure enough, Chris had contacted me here. "Anna, could you do me a favor and ask your sister what she thinks of her boyfriend? Is she in a bad mood today?" To maintain my cover, I pretended to be clueless. "Boyfriend? Does she have a boyfriend?" Chris responded immediately. "Of course. Go ask her, you'll find out." I suddenly had an idea. I messaged my own social account using the anonymous profile, creating a little drama. "AAA, sis, do you have a boyfriend now?" "Anna, no." "AAA, really? Don't lie to me." "Anna, I'm really not dating anyone." Then, I took a screenshot of our conversation and sent it to Chris with the caption. "She says she doesn't have a boyfriend." Chris lost it. "Impossible. Is this really your sister?" He sent a screenshot of my profile. I replied. "Yes. What's going on, Professor Miller?" He fell into silence, thinking for a long time. Eventually, I received his message. "Baby, have you stopped liking me?" A dull ache spread in my chest. But it quickly faded. I forced myself to type nonchalantly. "A little. I think I'm getting tired of it." "It's been over a year, don't you get tired?" He replied almost immediately. "No, not at all. Is there something I'm not doing right? I can change." "Baby, you said you wouldn't leave me." I started feeling miserable again. If I kept dragging this out, it would only be painful for both of us. Feeling the bitter pang in my heart, I decided to take the plunge. Even if he asked me for money, I could save up and pay him back. It was time to cut things off. No more delays. "I'm sorry, but we should break up." I had the courage to blacklist Chris. For a moment, I felt an overwhelming emptiness. But once the arrow is loosed, it doesn't come back. This way, Chris would never know he'd once dated one of his students. I tried to carry on with my life as usual. But whenever someone cut in line at the cafeteria or I was assigned extra work, I'd instinctively want to complain to Chris, only to remember I'd already blocked him. Chris tried to reach out through my anonymous account to win me back. But after I repeatedly told him I was not interested, he stopped messaging me there. Maybe he had finally accepted it. Aside from seeing him on the posters in the teaching building, I had completely cut ties with him. One day, Professor Smith called me in to fix a computer again. While I was troubleshooting, I overheard him on the phone. The usually calm Professor Smith suddenly looked pale. What? Which hospital? I'm coming right now. I casually asked, what happened? Professor Smith, who's sick? Professor Smith hurriedly gathered his things. Professor Miller, Chris, I'm sure you know him, sigh. I don't know what's been going on with him these last few days. I froze. Chris? Chris was in the hospital? Before I could process it, I grabbed Smith's sleeve without thinking. What? What happened to Professor Miller? Professor Smith jumped, startled by my sudden move. But he explained. He started losing his appetite a few days ago. He just collapsed at home. I felt like I'd been hit by a ton of bricks. He's not eating. Could it really be because of me? By the time I was about to ask for more details, Professor Smith had already grabbed his small bag and rushed off. I sat in Professor Smith's office, feeling like I was on pins and needles. After almost 2 hours, I couldn't hold back any longer and called him. It took a long time for him to pick up, his voice thick with exhaustion. Anna? I held the phone to my ear. Professor Smith. I wanted to ask how Professor Miller is doing. Realizing I might have overstepped, I quickly added. I have a relative who works at the hospital. Maybe I can help. Professor Smith sighed deeply, his tone filled with frustration, as if he couldn't believe the situation. Thanks, Anna, but it's fine. This fool got dumped and turned his low blood sugar into a real problem. On top of that, he already has stomach issues, so he'll need to stay in the hospital for a few days. My suspicions were confirmed in that moment. I couldn't quite describe the feeling that hit me, but all I knew was that I had to ask. Can I visit Professor Miller? I've cared for my mom when she was in the hospital. I'm pretty experienced. Professor Smith thought for a moment before responding. Well, if you want to help, that's good. I have a lecture this afternoon, so. Anna, I trust you to handle this. He's my son, just a few years older than you. Don't treat him like a professor, okay? I froze. Chris was Professor Smith's son? No wonder Professor Smith had been in such a hurry. For the first time, I turned down my roommate's invitation to a lecture. I quickly followed the address Professor Smith gave me, and when I arrived at the hospital, he handed things over to me before leaving. I entered the hospital room to find Chris lying against the headboard, and 4 needle in his arm, looking pale and fragile, his eyes slightly red. He turned his head to look at me when he heard the door, then quickly turned away again. I quietly walked over, took an orange from the nightstand, and started peeling it for him. After a long silence, I spoke carefully. Professor Miller, my sister told me everything. She said the breakup was just because you weren't a good match, not because of anything you did wrong. And she really doesn't want to see you like this. I handed him the peeled orange. She said she hopes you can take better care of yourself. Chris glanced at the orange in my hand, and it seemed like something clicked for him. He thought for a moment before picking up a strawberry from the fruit basket and handing it to me. You should have some. I shook my head, rejecting the offer. Thanks, but I don't really like strawberries. He paused, staring at me for a second, then looked up intently. You and your sister are pretty alike. Neither of you likes strawberries. And you both peel the strings off your oranges. That was something I had mentioned casually to my online boyfriend once. He actually remembered. My hand trembled slightly. Oh, really? Chris fixed his gaze on me. Your voice sounds the same too. I quickly tried to deepen my voice. I don't think so. Chris straightened up in bed, suddenly looking like he had more energy. Don't strain your voice. I pushed even harder. I'm not straining it. His deep, searching gaze felt like it was cutting right through me, as if he was trying to see into my very soul. Then, without warning, he asked. Why do you use your sister's puppy as your phone wallpaper? I hastily made up a lie. Because it's cute, So I just used it. I nervously stayed with Chris for a while. He kept asking me strange, off-the-wall questions, which made me feel on edge, my mind constantly racing to keep up with him. Once I saw that he'd eaten some food, I finally felt like I could leave in peace. That evening, when I got back to school, I received a call from Professor Smith. The old man sounded quite pleased. "Anna, you really know what you're doing. That fool has barely eaten anything, but now he finally has an appetite. He says he only feels like eating when you're there with him. If you're not around, he has no appetite. Can you find some time in the next few days to visit him again?" I couldn't refuse Professor Smith's requests. And especially since this whole situation was triggered by me, I felt obligated. But why would Chris tell Smith that? Had he figured something out? The more I thought about it, the more anxious I became. I barely slept a wink that night, the thought gnawing at me. The next day, I dragged myself out of bed, sporting 2 massive dark circles under my eyes, and headed back to the hospital to bring Chris his food. As soon as he saw me, he frowned. "Are you okay?" I was still half asleep, confused, and looked up dazedly. "Huh?" He reached out, the cool pads of his fingers lightly brushing over my dark circles. "Haven't been getting enough rest?" I panicked and quickly stepped back, putting some distance between us. I'm fine, really." He lowered his eyes quietly, opening his food container, and asked softly. "I'll be in the hospital for another week. You'll still come to see me, right?" I stood up straight, surprised. "But didn't Professor Smith say just 3 days?" Chris raised his eyes, pressing his lips together, watching me without saying a word. His eyes were unusually shiny, and for some reason, I felt a sudden weakness in my heart. "Okay, a week, then." Finally, he smiled, a rare, warm expression that lit up his face. I stayed by his side, making sure he ate, but as he continued, his gaze suddenly shifted to the bed next to him. There, a couple was eating together. The guy, with his right hand in a cast, sat in his bed, playfully whining. "My hands hurt. Can't you feed me?" The girl sighed with a smile, holding a spoon and feeding him bite by bite. Chris's gaze locked onto her hand, and then, slowly, he glanced down at his own hand, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. For a moment, I thought I saw something, longing? But it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure. The next day, when I went to see Chris, his right hand was wrapped in thick bandages, making it look bulky and a bit comical. I was taken aback. "What happened?" Chris looked down at his hand with a forlorn expression. "After you left yesterday, I tried to peel an apple for myself, but I accidentally cut myself." I quickly sat beside his bed. "So, can you still use your hand?" His eyelids dropped in embarrassment. "I tried, but it's not really working. The doctor told me not to use my right hand. But I'm not very good with my left. What should I do?" He kept glancing at the food box, his voice shrinking with each word. I scratched my head awkwardly. "Then, does that mean you need me to feed you?" And then quickly self-corrected. "But that's not really." He didn't let me finish, his gaze already filled with gratitude as he looked at me. "You're too kind, Anna. I really appreciate it." Why did I feel like there was something else in his eyes, something expectant? I stiffly opened the food container. Stiffly grabbed the spoon. Stiffly scooped and brought it to Chris's mouth. He smiled, his gaze locked on mine, warm and focused. I felt like I was sitting on pins and needles, avoiding his gaze. He ate with increasing enthusiasm, finishing the entire bowl of porridge in just a few minutes. He even seemed to want more. "Is that all?" Relieved, I shook my head. "No more." On the 3rd day, I'd gotten a little used to feeding Chris. As long as I kept thinking of him as just a giant cabbage. In the midst of Chris's almost suffocating gaze, I persevered and fed him another spoonful. Suddenly, there was a loud sound from the door, like something had fallen to the floor. I turned toward the noise. To my surprise, the doorway was now filled with a crowd. There were professors, students, all holding flowers or gifts to visit patients. And leading the pack was my roommate. She was staring at me, wide-eyed, and the fruit basket she was holding had fallen to the floor. I froze in place, still leaning in, spoon in hand, halfway through feeding Chris. My roommate was the first to react. She quickly motioned for everyone to step back and closed the door behind her. "Sorry. We didn't mean to disturb you." "So sorry." The door slammed shut, but the soundproofing wasn't great. I could still hear the buzz of voices outside. "Oh my God. There's actually a woman who can get that close to Professor Miller." "Hey, I couldn't see from my angle, but did they just kiss?" "What are you talking about?" "They were just eating." But it really looked like they were about to kiss. Professor Miller was looking at her like he was going to devour her. How can they be dating in a hospital room? I just sat there, feeling more and more uncomfortable. Chris, apparently hearing the murmurs outside, slowly curled his lips into a smile. My face turned redder than I thought possible. I had no idea what to do. I stood up, feeling flustered. Should I go explain this to them?" Chris grabbed my wrist, tilting his head. "Explain what?" I stammered, lost for words. "Well, we're not." He interrupted me. "It's just a misunderstanding. No need to explain." When I didn't respond right away, he blinked and added, "Or are you really bothered by this?" I shook my head vigorously. He sighed in relief. "Then it's fine. Let them misunderstand." I blinked at him, confused. "Huh?" Chris quickly realized the ambiguity in his words and hastily added, "I mean, don't worry about it. It's all just a misunderstanding." The next day, when I returned to my dorm, my roommate was waiting for me, her expression a mix of shock and curiosity. "Anna, what's going on between you and Professor Miller?" Luckily, I was at the front, so no one could see your face too clearly. I shook my head repeatedly, trying to stay calm. "I'm not. I didn't. Smith professor just asked me to take care of him." She wasn't buying it at all, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Come on. When you were feeding him, his eyes were glued to you. Don't tell me you two don't have anything going on." I kept shaking my head, but she was getting more agitated by the second. "Do you know how many people are after Miller professor's good looks? They come from all over the university, even from the sports faculty. But he only lets you get close to him. If you don't take advantage of this, I'll lose all respect for you." "Take advantage of what?" I wasn't interested in any of that. Just getting Chris out of the hospital safely was enough of a blessing for me. A week later, Chris was finally discharged from the hospital. Before I left, I casually asked the doctor about Chris's condition. The doctor shook his head. My heart skipped a beat, and I braced myself for bad news. "That patient in bed 3. He's perfectly fine. Should have been good after 2 days of 4 fluids, but he insisted on staying for an entire week of observation. He's a handsome young man, why would he want to stay in the hospital?" As the doctor walked away, I stood there, my mind spinning with questions. Chris wanted to stay in the hospital? What was he thinking? He could have easily left, but he stayed. Could it be because of me? Maybe he was trying to trap me somehow? Was he hoping for some sort of consequence because of our breakup? Though the hospital was close to school, bringing him meals every day wasn't easy. The more I thought about it, the more I suspected. I decided then that I would never attend his lectures again. As soon as I made that resolution, my anonymous account received a message from Chris. "Anna, come to my office." In his office, there was only Chris. We sat across from each other in tense silence, the atmosphere thick with unspoken words. He pointed at the computer screen and spoke first. "I just received the course schedule from the Academic Affairs office. For next semester, your class will need to take my course." I froze for a moment. Why was he telling me this? Was he really going to drag me into some sort of scheme? He noticed my nervousness and smiled, trying to reassure me. Don't worry, I just wanted to let you know. I nodded numbly. Then, before I could finish, he suddenly sighed deeply. Actually, I really miss your sister. Without her around, life just feels dull. My anxiety spiked. You really like her? Chris looked at me with serious eyes and nodded. I really do. Do you think your sister would consider getting back together with me? I'll agree to anything. I was lost for words, feeling like I had no ground to stand on. She probably has her own thoughts about it. He studied my expression carefully, his gaze intense. If your sister broke up with me because of some difference in status, would it be possible for her to talk to me first? I froze. He knew? How could he possibly know? But I forced myself to stay calm. I don't know. I can't interfere with her thoughts. Chris didn't push any further. He closed the pen lid with a soft click. I have one more favor to ask you. Could you please pass my message along to your sister? Let her know I want to meet with her. Before I could refuse, he pointed at the course schedule on the screen, making his intentions clear. I'll be teaching your class next semester. I immediately agreed. It was a no-brainer. Who didn't know how difficult Chris's classes were? He had incredibly high academic standards and often gave closed-book exams. The moment he showed me that schedule, I knew exactly what he was trying to do. He was pressuring me. Of course I can't actually meet with Chris. Thankfully, I do have an older sister. I begged my sister for 5 hours before she finally agreed to meet Chris for me. The meeting location was chosen by Chris, a chic little French restaurant. I hid nearby, watching them closely. When my sister arrived, Chris looked up and smiled. But the smile froze on his face. It only lasted a moment, though. They quickly shook hands, then launched into a lively conversation. For an hour and a half, neither of them stopped talking. They must have been having a great time. I watched them, and before I knew it, I had crumpled the little leather cap I was holding. When my sister came over and patted me on the back, I snapped back to reality. She looked excited, practically glowing. Where did you find someone so perfect for an online romance? You can't breaking up, I'll help you keep this going. But, weirdly, he didn't mention anything about getting back together, just small talk. Doesn't seem like he's interested in reconciliation. I was taken aback. Are you serious? She shot me a look. Do I look like I'm joking? Honestly, I really like him, he's so handsome. I paused, quietly processing. Though I felt the same way, I couldn't help but hesitate. Why don't you go ahead and ask him for his personal social media? She agreed without a second thought, already turning to go after him. But as soon as she stood up, she froze. Professor Miller. Why aren't you leaving yet? I turned toward the voice. And only then did I realize Chris was standing just a short distance away, looking at us, quietly, bathed in the backlight. His tone was calm, not rushed. Anna, how long are you going to keep pretending? I froze in shock. After I apologizing to my sister, Chris dragged me into a private room at the restaurant. I huddled in the chair like a quail. He called over the waiter and casually listed a few of my favorite dishes. Then, he turned back to me. Anything else you'd like to order? I shook my head repeatedly. He closed the menu. Earlier. I've actually been keeping an eye on you with my peripheral vision. I tightened my lips. Really? How come I only saw him chatting so happily with my sister? Seeing that I was silent, he tilted his head and leaned in closer to me. Really don't want to talk about it? I glanced up at his handsome face, just inches away, and gave a shy smile. When did you figure it out? The moment the question left my mouth, I regretted it. If it was before today, then I've been acting for nothing, isn't it awkward to know now? He interrupted my spiraling thoughts. If you don't want to say, it's fine. I do want to say, he replied with a serious tone. Anything about you, I want to share. He began to reminisce. I started to suspect something when I saw your little habits at the hospital. Then, I asked my dad for your social media contact. He didn't need to say more, as I already wanted to sink into the floor. He knew from the time I went to the hospital. No wonder he'd been acting so familiar with me the past few days. There were too many people at school who knew how to reach me. With a little comparison, he must have figured it out. I knew I couldn't keep it a secret much longer. Ugh. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to lie to you, I bowed repeatedly, frantically apologizing, nearly in tears. I'll keep your secret, I swear I won't let your private photos leak. But Chris held me firmly, not allowing me to bend any further. He looked me straight in the eyes, his tone calm and serious. Never apologize to me for that. Though, those photos. I privately only wanted you to see them. But if you really want to share them, that's up to you. He paused before adding, and about the secret, at the lecture, everyone knew I had a girlfriend. I didn't hide that because it was just an online relationship. I slowly started to find some comfort in his warm and focused gaze. But I still wasn't entirely reassured. Then could you not fail me? Ugh. He sighed, exasperated, and put a hand to his forehead. Who said I'm going to fail you? I reminded him. But you did say, that day, that I'd be taking your class next semester. He looked even more exasperated. I just meant we'd see each other more often next semester. I thought by saying that, you might reconsider and meet me in person. If you hadn't agreed, I would have kept asking you. Who knew it was actually your sister who showed up? I stood there, momentarily stunned, still processing. He continued. My dad told me you went to the hospital on your own and even suggested taking care of me. I thought that meant you had feelings for me. So why break up with me? The shift in your attitude started after the lecture. I can only think, that day, you were there. You realized the one you were dating was me. So the reason for breaking up could only be that I didn't meet your expectations in real life. But you obviously liked the photos I sent you, so it's not because of my appearance. That leaves only my identity. I was left speechless, taken aback by his clear and logical analysis. So, he knew everything. In the end, Chris hesitated, almost as if he had to summon all his strength to ask. Anna, you don't like me, do you? I almost answered instantly. No. He looked at me, somewhat stunned. Then, what is it? I lowered my gaze, avoiding his eyes. I just feel like you wouldn't like it. And, Professor Miller, do you know how many people admire you? Now that you know that account belongs to a normal student like me, do you still like me? He was almost frozen, his disbelief slowly surfacing. You. I looked down, feeling gloomy. So I was right. But then Chris blurted out. You think you're a normal student? President of the volunteer club, top 3 in the college GPA rankings every year, 2 gold medals in subject competitions, my dad's most proud student, this is your definition of normal? And, do you not know how attractive you are? I fell for you the moment I saw you without any pretenses. No matter what you wear, I'll still like you. As long as the object is you, I can't be more happy. My face turned slightly red. I opened my mouth but couldn't make a sound. After a long pause, I managed to say. How did you even check my GPA? He burst out laughing. I didn't check it, my dad mentioned it to me. He really likes you. Hearing that made me feel a little more confident. I sat up straighter but still stumbled over my words. But your persona has always been, distant, reserved. You probably wouldn't want anyone to know what we're really like together. He raised an eyebrow. Persona? I never had that kind of persona. I'm just not interested in certain things. But you're different. If you want me to change, I'm completely fine with it. In the end, Chris pouted and made me unblock him from my blacklist. As soon as I did, I received a transfer of $5,000. I froze. What are you doing? His gaze was steady. This is to see if I've really been blocked. Right after the breakup, I tried a lot of times. I felt a little embarrassed and tried to change the topic. Why are you still trying? To my surprise, he responded faster than I did. You said you'd send me $5 for strawberries, and you'd pay me back. He pointed to the chat history where I had typed it myself. Can you make good on that now? I covered my face, embarrassed and angry. But you transferred too much. He was completely unbothered. Now I want you to pay me back 1,000 times, and give me 1,000 kisses. I was speechless. Though he was being so, bold now. He was still the same aloof, untouchable handsome guy at school. The reason was simple. I felt like that private side of him was something I could enjoy all to myself. My roommate often asked me about my progress with Chris, but I kept quiet. Only late at night, I'd receive explicit photos from him. I'd blush every time I saw them. Chris teased me. I knew you liked them. You even tried to lie and say you didn't. I was furious and embarrassed. What do you mean by that? He quickly explained. I mean, thank goodness you like them, and lucky for me, I have them. That way, I can send them to you every day, to win your favor. I turned even redder, glancing at the new photos he sent. I hastily covered my screen, afraid someone might see. The waistband of his pants was getting lower and lower. By the time the next semester rolled around, as Chris predicted, we had to take one of his courses. At the first class, he introduced himself. 3 full pages of research experience, he breezed through. But when he got to his marital status, he specifically added, I'm currently unmarried, but very happy with my girlfriend. His eyes, smiling, swept over the class before pointing directly at me. I shrank into the second-to-last row, burying my head, too embarrassed to meet his gaze. My roommate tugged on my sleeve. Anna. Look. Professor Miller looks so happy. People used to say he was so strict, but he seems to really like our class. I cautiously looked up. And our eyes met. I immediately had a bad feeling. Sure enough, during the interactive session, he gently called out. Anna. Everyone else thought he seemed much gentler now. But I felt like he was going to demand something from me. By the end of that class, I had stood up more times than in the entire last semester. Chris, can you be a bit more low-key? Please, I begged, pulling him into a secluded corner and clasping my hands together. He raised an eyebrow. I thought I was already being pretty low-key. I widened my eyes. You don't know that everyone's saying I'm your most spoiled student? He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and nodded in agreement. That's true. You really are. Ugh, why is he so sweet right now? I tugged at his collar. We agreed to keep this a secret until I graduate. But I was so forceful and pretending to be angry that I accidentally popped 2 of the buttons on his shirt. He looked at me, a smile dancing in his eyes. Anna, what are you doing? Then he leaned down, his lips brushing my ear as he whispered in a teasing, intimate tone. Tonight. I'll show you plenty. I froze, not knowing how to respond. Chris claimed he was trying to keep a low profile. But every class, he always interacted with me. And as soon as he entered the classroom, he was always eager to search for my spot among the students. It was obvious to everyone that he treated me differently. So, right before the midterm exams, my classmates started sending me private messages. Please, Anna, can you tell Professor Miller not to make the exam closed book? This is only the midterm, a closed book exam will be the death of me. I thought for a moment. Then turned and bumped right into Chris's chest. He bent down to look at me, smiling softly. Do you want an open book exam too? I nodded eagerly. Yes. He pointed at his lips. Kiss me, and I'll consider it. I stood on my tiptoes and leaned in. But he wasn't satisfied. Just as my lips were about to pull away, he wrapped his arms around my waist. "Give me one more." I widened my eyes. "You." Before I could say more, he had already gently pried my lips open. As the kiss deepened, he slowly laid me back onto the sofa. I hooked my legs around his thigh, and he followed the movement, pressing himself down. He kissed me with even more intensity, taking my breath away. I didn't know how long passed, but eventually, my legs were too weak to stand. I pushed against his chest in a desperate attempt to break free. Reluctantly, he pulled away, reaching for his phone to send a message. "Midterm exam, open book format." I glared at him from behind. Who would have guessed that the supposedly abstinent Chris wasn't abstinent at all? A year later, after graduation, I could finally go on dates with Chris without hiding from anyone. We walked through the streets hand in hand. Chris suddenly sighed. "I'm so happy." He looked down at our intertwined fingers. "Is this what they mean by holding hands and growing old together?" I thought for a moment and replied. "We're not old yet, we'll talk about that when we are." Later that evening, we passed by a bakery, and the voice from the loudspeakers caught our attention. "With the most important person, to watch the most romantic moon." Chris stopped in his tracks, looking up at the sky. There, a bright moon hung high. He gazed at it, lost in thought. "Anna, do you know? I've always thought the moon is so pure and beautiful. The moonlight spreads everywhere, but there's only one moon." I followed his gaze, but before I could see it clearly, I suddenly felt a soft kiss on my cheek. He leaned in and whispered in my ear. "Anna, you're my moon." Under the moonlight, our hands, still tightly clasped, held each other even more firmly. Hand in hand, growing old together.